I had completed 3 years in the seminary. It was a very exciting time, especially amongst young seminarians in Rome, and in those days there were thousands of young seminarians. There were 30 Australians when I arrived, about 90 when I left in 1967. I missed the first session of the council, but I was there for the last 3 sessions, from 63 to 65. Oh, well, we were naive and optimistic, and we expected a new Pentecost. We thought that with these few changes to modernise things, the world would come flocking to our banners. Didn't quite work out like that, but the Vatican Council achieved many wonderful things. I know some of the Australian bishops had thought that it would be over in 3 or 4 months and they'd be back home. But by the time I went to Rome, it was quite clear that that wasn't going to happen. I think administratively under John XXIII, he wasn't a great manager. So Paul VI, who came in from the second session on, really had to pull it together so that it would go somewhere. Because in the first session they threw out most of the draft proposals that had been proposed. Well, I lived right next to St. Peter's on the Janiculum Hill overlooking Rome. It's a marvellous spot. It's the only spot in the world, they claim, where the diocesan clergy look down on the Jesuits because their headquarters are right next door. Nero had some of his gardens there, and between the Janiculum and St. Peter's, where St. Peter was buried, there was a great circus, Nero's circus. It's a beautiful spot. So from my study, I could look right across St. Peter's Square to Paul VI's study. And in my last year, I was studying late, but every night except once, and I was studying at midnight, sometimes early hours in the morning. Pope Paul's light was still on work. He was a workaholic. He was a great worker. Yeah, well, life is full of surprises. Pope John XXIII was an old man when he was elected, thought of as something of a caretaker pope, and he did this revolutionary thing of calling a Vatican Council. He died after the first session, and as I mentioned, Pope Paul took it forward. All the speeches were in Latin, for example. The bishops attended every day in choir dress. Right down the middle of St. Peter's they had banked seating. There were over 2,000 bishops present. If we ever have another full council, I don't know where they'd be able to put them, because I think there are 4,000 bishops now. Nearly all the bishops knew Latin. Well, all of them knew Latin to some extent, but they couldn't have simultaneous translation because they didn't have enough translators who knew Latin to go from that into the vernacular. Some of my fellow students were working regularly as ushers and that of the council, so they arranged for me to come in for one of the sessions one morning, and so I did that while the bishops were meeting and discussing, and visited. There were 2 bars. I forget whether Bar Jonah was one. I forget what the other one might. Barabbas was it? Visited those, so it was very interesting to see to see it in progress. The Second Vatican Council was the 21st Ecumenical Council. That means a council of all the churches. There are disputes about which councils are truly regarded as ecumenical, belong to all the church, and what aren't. But traditionally the church has gathered that when it faces great challenges, or when there has been a great change of circumstances. The first great council was the Council of Nicaea, Now that was called by the new Christian emperor. He wasn't Christian then, but the new emperor who gave religious freedoms to Christians, Constantine, and he actually presided at some of the sessions. He was very interested in it. I think at one stage he called himself the 13th Apostle. So, and one of the big tensions throughout history has been for the Church to obtain a measure of independence over against the government. And we call that the separation of church and state. And I think it's much more important for the Church than it is for the state, although politicians mightn't say that. So another great council, of course, was the Council of Trent in the 16th century. The popes were very slow to call that, because in the century before there had been a movement called the conciliarist movement, which claimed that the councils were above the Pope. It was 20 years after Luther started the Protestant Reformation before they called the Council of Trent, and it meandered on for another 20 years. It made a number of enormous contributions. I think the most important is which we still use, is the creation of the Tridentine Seminary. That is, where to be a priest, you don't just do a couple of courses or a lot of courses, but you come in and live in a community for 7 or 8 years, and there's an attempt to develop patterns of life, community living, personality, to give a real and priestly formation. It's been tweaked and changed significantly, but it still works. And it's part of the reason why Catholic priests are still such a formidable force in society. Another contribution from the Council of Trent was the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Now, there's a long, meandering, contentious history before that was put together. And actually it came about as a result of pressure from the Catholic Emperor. I think it was Charles V, because Charles said, in my Catholic domains, I need people who understand the basics of church teaching, so they can explain it to the young people, so we can hang on to our Catholics. Because the Protestants were using these catechisms. Catechism is a question and answer form. Why did God make us? God made us to know Him, love Him, and serve Him here on this earth, and to be happy with Him forever in heaven. Who made the world? God made the world. These are the catechisms of my youth. And of course, the other great thing was, in a certain sense, Luther saved the Church from himself, because it forced the Church to take its religious claims seriously. Now, there were Catholic reformers right through the Middle Ages. Very well known one was Savonarola up in Florence. Michelangelo was a great devotee of Savonarola, calling for renewal. But Luther and the other Protestant reformers refocused on the centrality of religion. And the Council of Trent defined Catholic vitality and Catholic life over and against the Protestant reformers. So it re-emphasised the importance of the sacraments, of the community of the Church, of the structure of the Church, the role of the papacy. And of course, in those days, they didn't just dialogue and perhaps argue as we might today. Armies fought over it. People were in both sides were imprisoned. The Protestant reformers many of them were pretty fierce, which is not to say that Catholics wouldn't resort to arms either to maintain the status quo. It was a different age. I think it was Chou En-lai was supposed to have been asked that question when he was alive 20 or 30 years ago about the French Revolution of 1789, and he said it's a bit early to tell. So it changed things dramatically in some areas, and psychologically it also changed Catholic life. I mean, there was no pressure in the English-speaking world, certainly in Australia, for the Second Vatican Council. None whatsoever. And there wasn't much pressure throughout the world. There was pressure for slow, incremental change. But this was an idea that Pope John Paul, as the leader of the Church, gave to the Church, and that unleashed all sorts of unexpected and revolutionary forces. It brought about changes that had to take place and are very good. One of the most obvious in Australian life would say is the support for ecumenism. That is friendship, dialogue, mutual prayer, cooperation, where possible, with Anglicans and Protestants and Orthodox. Now, that wasn't encouraged by us at all. My father was an Anglican. I'd never been we were forbidden to go into non-Catholic churches. I'd never been into such a church. It was very difficult even to get permission for Catholics to attend the weddings or funerals of Protestants in those churches. So the ecumenical movement is an enormous blessing that the Second Vatican Council has brought. Another big change was that the Second Vatican Council encouraged us, what we call grandly, to dialogue with the world, not to be closed in on ourselves. For example, our situation before the Council was somewhat similar to the situation of the Greek Orthodox here in Australia today, where by and large the clergy are still Greek. There are a few Australian Greek clergy, but they mind their own business. Society doesn't interfere too much. Our situation was a bit like that here. And the Vatican Council encouraged us to talk to the world around us, perhaps to dispute, but to emphasise what we have in common and to discuss rationally rather than from a hostile and enclosed either ghetto or enclave. There always was a very high level of intermarriage here in Australia between Protestants and Catholics, although it's much higher again now. But there was a lot of that, and especially the Irish Australian Catholics were a very real presence politically through the Labor Party and a very noticeable part of society. But nonetheless, we did have, as a sub-culture, and which was predominantly Irish-Australian then. It was only after the Second World War that we had waves of migrants. First of all, the Italians, Maltese, then more recently Vietnamese, many parts of Asia, many parts of the world. That came after the Second World War. And there was enough hostile pressure and suspicion from the society around us to help keep the Catholic community together. And of course the Catholics had their great historical grievance, which was that the government had taken away government money from the 1870s right through to the 1960s, government money for government schools. And that was felt to be, as it was, a gross injustice, and that helped weld keep the community together. Well, of course, in those days, you see, we had many religious, so we were able to do that. They worked for nothing, literally, pocket money. So we had these enormously capable men and women. I think some of the nuns who set up our great hospitals, they were absolutely formidable women. One of the funny things that's happened in the Catholic Church, by and large, is that after the Second Vatican Council, and with the arrival of the women's movement, many of the Catholic women in our organisations moved out of leadership positions to be at first hand and to be helping people. So we had many, so in the early 1900s, we had many more Catholic secondary schools for girls than we had for boys. There are a couple of reasons for that. That is, the Irish Australians were quite happy for their women to be educated, but they wanted the fellas to get out and either work on the farm or have a job. And secondly, we had more nuns than brothers, and so we had the staff who could staff these schools and ran them completely without government funding. There are a number of very symbolic changes. So the language of the Latin went from Latin into the vernacular, in our case in English. Another enormous change followed as a consequence from what's called the doctrine of collegiality. Centrally, the doctrine is that the bishops share in the leadership of the Church with the Pope. But that has consequences down the line, because the great innovation in the document on the Church was that it spoke about all the baptized first and then the hierarchy second. So still today in public discussion, people will sometimes say to me, "When did you join the Church?" They're asking, "When did I become a priest?" And I say, "Well, I joined the Church of Baptism, and I became a priest when I was 25. Now, with this emphasis on all the faithful and their active role in the Church, that meant that we now have parish councils, school boards, lay boards for all our... we didn't have that in the Church. I remember hearing a story about my uncle on my mother's side, Mum's brother, in the 1920s in Ballarat East. And there was big trouble in the Catholic tennis club because the parish priest wanted to appoint all the members of the committee, and they wanted to elect some of them. A little bit of exaggeration, my uncle said, you know, our boys were fighting and dying for freedom in Ireland, and here they couldn't even get freedom in their local tennis club to elect a few people. So it's they're very symbolic and important differences. It's important to realise there were, amongst the reformers at the council, those who wanted to change things, they were inspired by two basic drives, which are to some... Both these elements were amongst the reformers. They're potentially in conflict, certainly in tension. Now, one of the drives is to bring things up to date. It's called aggiornamento. And we all want to be up to date. No one wants to be described as old-fashioned. The other great drive was to go back to the sources. In that case, Christ, the New Testament, what was the secret of Christianity. And for some reason that was known under the French name rather than the Italian aggiornamento as ressourcement. Now, these two forces have continued to struggle in the Church since. And neither Pope John Paul II nor Pope Benedict are in any sense old-fashioned people. And they do want the Church to be up to date, but an equally important role for them is that the Church remains faithful to its basic Christian roots. So they're very much in the ressourcement school. So it has all sorts of practical consequences, because today some people, for example, on marriage, family, life issues, they want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, completely reform the Christian way of looking at these things. So homosexual activity they would want legitimised, not just premarital sex legitimised, but We go very lightly on adultery, divorce and remarriage, that abortion be allowed, perhaps euthanasia be allowed, and all these things are subversive of essential Christian teaching. So, but that's an example of the out-of-date school running right ahead of what is possible within the Catholic tradition.
Big questions at the moment.
Yeah, they are. You see the seeds of the present tensions in the Church. They didn't come from nowhere. They've grown up in part of our history. And one of the things that happened after the Second Vatican Council was things didn't work out the way we planned at all. So we thought there'd be a great increase in vocations, there'd be at least as many people coming into the church, perhaps more. Now, it worked out fairly well in most other parts of the world, except the Western world to which we belong. So in some parts of the Catholic community, which were highly disciplined, highly Catholic, there was a spectacular revolt and a radical collapse. For example, in Holland, certainly French-speaking Canada is another part, and also Belgium's in trouble, Switzerland, to some extent Austria. Now things have worked out more slowly in Ireland, but at the moment the situation in Ireland is finally balanced. In the cities there's been a great decline in church going. The countryside is still strong. I just saw the last day or so Archbishop Dermot Martin, and I think he's overstating. He's declared the city of Dublin to be a missionary area. Now in Holland, where now there's a couple of percent of people, 2 or 3%, it's a great centre for euthanasia, or all sorts of unusual forms of cohabitation and all that. Holland at the time of the council in the 60s had probably more missionaries overseas than Ireland, and it had a level of Catholic practice that were, in many of the villages there, they go to Mass, or they go not to Mass, go to Mass once on Sunday, and then they go for Vespers or devotions in the evening. So, and in our part of the world, rather than getting extra vocations, it's only now we're starting to claw our way back a bit. So when I studied in Werribee, then there was another house at Glen Waverley, there were 200 young men studying for the Catholic priesthood. Now in Melbourne, they've just brought the figure back up to 50, and that's much better than it was 20 years ago. And not only that, but thousands throughout the Western world of priests and nuns and brothers left their vocations to go, and a few of them, not many of them, a few of them lost their faith, but many of them went to work for the church in lay roles or go into the society. The Second Vatican Council changed nothing on marriage and family. What has changed, of course, is that the rate of, in our part of the world, the rate of family breakdown has radically increased, so that the church facility for an annulment, meeting certain criteria, that there was never a full and true marriage, that's now much more used than it was in the past. There's often an enormous amount of misunderstanding about the role of conscience after the Vatican II, and some people will say, almost as though they believe it, that after the Second Vatican Council you're now inclined to follow your conscience and do whatever you think's right. Now the Second Vatican Council said, never taught that at all. I mean, that's not Christian teaching. What the Vatican Council did do was to speak about religious liberty. It says that the state has no right to require people, for example, to follow any sort of religion, and the state should allow people to choose religiously. But for those who choose to be Catholic, they still have the same obligations to follow Catholic teaching as they always have. Now, when people are better educated, they're more inclined to choose. But there's no Catholic rule now that says, if you don't agree with the Catholic Church, it's perfectly okay for you to think anything you like on abortion and euthanasia and adultery, or, for example, on social justice, or that you should be able to lie, or that the Catholic Church allows terrorism for religious purposes. The same basic teachings apply. Now, we're not going to go running around throwing people out of the church because they disagree with those, but Catholics are still called to accept Catholic teachings. Most of the things that are happening to the Catholic community, most of them, many of them, are the result of changes in society. But in some ways we've cut our own throat. We've tried to adapt to these forces and go along with them, and in some cases that's just stripped us of our vitality and our identity. Now, there are two things. At the Second Vatican Council, most of the bishops there, and certainly the students like myself that were there, were naive, historically ignorant and optimistic. We overestimated our capacity to cope with the society around us. I remember once being at a secondary school, and I said to the headmaster, the students listen to, there was year 11 and 12, I said, the students listen to me well. And he said, yes, he said, but they'll go home and watch 2 hours of television tonight too. And they'll listen very much to that. So, and see, we wanted to escape from the ghetto. We no longer wanted to be locked up there, which, as I said, was a significant exaggeration. But we underestimated the influence of culture and community. You see, for example, the pressures against marriage and family life are absolutely enormous today. Now, I suspect we'll hang on to the faith probably better than we'll resist some of the depredations that have been done to family life. And that's the way it's happening in everybody's family now. Nearly everybody's family, cousin or somewhere, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, there's a divorce or divorces. And so, to go back to the general theme, we need to support one another. We need community. We need culture. We need structures to help explain what we're doing and to provide mutual reinforcement. Not in any defensive, isolated. We've got to interact with the society around us, but we need those community structures. I was just reading a Christian writer. He's an American. He's a Lutheran, and I wouldn't agree with this, but he said, look, the church should stop trying to influence society around us and just work on hanging on to what it's got and explaining what we're about to the people who belong to us. Now, I don't think it's an either-or, but we certainly have got to concentrate on our core business, but we've got to recognise how much our core business is influenced by the world around us. And the other thing we've got to realise, and you get into trouble, people don't like you saying this, the churches that adopt more radically, the Christian churches that the more radically they adopt the ways of the society around them, the quicker they go out of business. Now the intuition is to say, well, the more you adapt, the more people will like you and join. You might get more favourable editorials from the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, but you don't get joiners. And the religious groups that are surviving and prospering have a sense of their own identity, and they require people to do something. They don't say so I say to people, you can't be a Catholic and it can't be cost-free. And also, if it's cut price too much, it doesn't work. No, it's the last thing I'd want is another Vatican Council. Last thing I'd want. I think, see, we regularly now have synods. There'll be one later this year of 250 bishops, delegates from around the world. They'll meet to discuss the scriptures, the Word of God, and how we try to put it out. Another thing that's changed is that now all the 10 or 15 or 20, like the heads of government departments, like congregations and councils in Rome, have international members, and they meet every 18 months or so. So we're continually, where we have, there used to be bishops' conference meetings regularly. We meet twice a year. So we're regularly redoing that. But we don't need a new wave of radical reforms. Our task now in this part of the world is to consolidate, to strengthen our core business. I mentioned that the Second Vatican Council made an enormous contribution to ecumenism, to us cooperating actively and fully with other Christian forces. So the old sectarian struggles of Australian history, Irish versus English, Protestant versus Catholic, I mean, they're wrong in principle for the followers of Christ, but they're also counterproductive politically, socially. The significant tension in Australia today is between those of a broadly Judeo-Christian cast of mind and an aggressive secular minority who wants to dismantle, say, the laws in our society which reflect the Judeo-Christian understanding of things. So, and sometimes evangelical Protestants are a bit surprised to hear me talk like that. I spoke at a recent pub in North Sydney for Theology on Tap, and we had 300 or 400, mainly young Catholics there. But I was speaking to 3 evangelical Christians, Anglicans, Protestants, and they were surprised that I made this point, and they said, you know, you're not anti-Protestant. And I said, no, I'm not. I try to emphasise what we have in common, because I think the real game is elsewhere.
Thank you very much.